Alrighty, our final module is Chapter 20, Part 2, and we're going to be looking at um, the changing culture in America in the interwar period between World War I and World War II. Specifically, this is going to be impacted a lot with the Great Depression. So we talked a lot about women's suffrage, and I don't want to beleaguer the point, but one of the things I think that's really important is to note that segregation reaches into the women's suffrage movement, that there are two sides of this argument, that you have white women who are challenging male dominance in the political arena, but then you also have African American women who are trying to push for women's suffrage as well. The new National Women's Party is more militant and oppositional. This is led by Alice Paul. And one of the things they do is they have a march in Washington, the Women's Suffrage Parade of 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And you have both African American women and white women participating in this march. But unfortunately, the black women are kind of thrust to the back end of the march. And this cartoon on the right kind of demonstrates this. The title of it is Just Like the Men. So women are just as bad, white women are just as bad as the white men in terms of ostracizing African American activism. So just to kind of throw this out there, there is an organization known as the National Association opposed to women's suffrage. This was formed by Josephine Jewell Dodge, who was a Washington socialite. And basically they're saying that women should not be able to vote. And so you can see all of these cartoons at the bottom, and there's a picture of one of the headquarters. And as the debate for suffrage moved from the state level to the national level, remember most of the Western states support women's suffrage, and the idea is they're moving from the state level to the national level because eventually they're going to have an amendment ratified from the different states for the Constitution. But really what they're arguing is that women don't really need it or nor want it in terms of the vote. There's competition of women with men instead of cooperation. In these pictures that you see, it's almost like they're playing off this role reversal, that women become more like men and men become more like women. And certainly that's not what they were going for at all. But it's interesting to note that there were organizations out there advocating against women gaining the right to vote. And they were chaired and led by women. And the important thing to remember here is that most of the women that were part of this organization were upper class women, not middle class. Most middle class women were supporting the movement for women gaining the right to vote. Gosh. So you have the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, and so they're voting for the first time in the election of 1920. And as you can see, the majority of the states in dark are ones that support women's suffrage and the date when they were allowed to vote. And it's interesting to note, like, Wyoming is 1890, Idaho is 1896. So they're long-term support of women voting. And so coming along with this idea of women gaining the right to vote, we have the emerging changes within fashion and society of women's roles. And fashion is a great way to kind of trace this, because you have the rise of what we call the flapper. Coco Chanel popularizes the flapper, wearing loose-fitting clothing, and it's not the, covering the whole body like it used to be. The clothing is light, it's wearable, it's comfortable and elegant, and women were able to expose their ankles, in some cases their knees, which was considered very This was something that most women did not do prior to this point. But fashion was meant to be sexually provocative and emphasize youth. Lose the corsets, the clothing was loose and emphasized natural lines. Flappers became the fashion icon of the 1920s. They were smoking, they were dancing, they were drinking, and they were sexually provocative. This is a complete change from the Gilded Age cult of domesticity or true womanhood. This is almost on the other side of the scale. And women begin to be focused in advertising. So why would a advertisement for Chevrolet have a woman driving the car? Well, they began doing market research and found that women had a strong influence on men when deciding to buy vehicles. And so they began to appeal to the woman. Cigarettes were using women as sexually provocative figures. Certainly, this is a huge step away from advertising from the Gilded Age. Women were also graduating college, going to graduate school, becoming doctors. And as you can see, the college graduation rates for men and women between 1876 and 1975. So we start to see this moving up even into the modern age. Women were working in the workplace. Now, they weren't taking all the jobs. They were focused, there becomes this kind of gender-specific type of job. So telephone operators were mostly women, and that's the picture in the center at the top. Clerical work or secretary work was mostly gender-specific to females. And you can kind of see in this chart on the left, married women gainfully employed in 1920, in what areas they're working and what areas where they are more dominant than men. The birth rate changes. You start to see between 1920 and 1930 a drop in the birth rate. Some of that is the Great Depression, so you got to keep that in mind. But some of it is also that women are deciding to either not get married or not have children, or perhaps marry and have children at a later time in their life. And you have the movement towards women's equal rights, the Equal Rights Amendment, first proposed by Alice Paul and the National Women's Party. It proposed to eliminate all legal distinctions on account of sex. It's interesting because there were people who automatically were against this, mostly because of if you don't draw a distinction between women and men, those pensions for single mothers would go away. And you would have workplace protections like limits on working hours for women that would also go away. And so in 1929, Congress repeals the Shepard-Towner Act of 1921, which had provided financial assistance to programs for maternity and child care. It was renewed in 26, but it met with a great deal of criticism. So you start to see that there's a downside to considering women the equal of men. Most of these are from a government funding standpoint. African Americans also see a great deal of movement in this time period, and it launches into the new Negro movement. Now, the last time we talked about African Americans, we were talking about the Great Migration. And so when African Americans began to move into the urban North, it launches a renaissance of African American culture, music, literature, all kinds of things. And they brand this the new Negro movement, that this is no longer the deferential African American, the one that says yes sir, no sir to any white person. they begin to realize that they have a unique culture, a unique history, all their own, and they begin to take pride in that. And that's a huge thing. So what is the new Negro? The idea of a black person who, through intellect and production of art, literature, and music, could challenge the pervading racism and stereotypes to promote progressive or socialist politics and racial and social integration. So breaking down the walls of racism and trying to promote more equality within politics and within government. The movement stresses cultural awareness, understanding the uniqueness of African American culture and arts, self-confidence. The sign down there at the bottom, the new Negro has no fear. There's an assertiveness and self-defense that African Americans have not felt in a large, for the entire population, in a very long time. And so it gives them this sense of destiny and control over their destiny. The Harlem Renaissance is a direct result from all of this. The impact of the Great Migration, you start seeing people embracing Pan-Africanism, Marcus Garvey's ideas on the unique culture that is African American. Carter Woodson creates the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. He also begins Black History Month, which what he would do is he would print every year the ASALH, which is the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, would produce material that they would mail out to black schools across the country, even in the South. And it would encourage them to read about African American figures of the past, like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. And there were, papers about how to do a play or create a play or a pageant. And white school boards would look at this and say, well, all of this material that they're sending, we're not having to pay for. So you know what? We're not going to worry about it. That's great. If somebody else is willing to pay for this, then we'll allow it. So they kind of slide under the radar in terms of the South. And for many of these children, this is the first time they're ever hearing anything about African American history. And these are African American children who are growing up literally in Jim Crow and facing racial violence on a daily basis. And this is a very empowering move for many African Americans. You have the rise of African American music, like the Cotton Club in New York City. Black musicians could perform there. They could not drink or eat there. But you have a circuit that emerges between New York, Chicago, St. Louis. These become major cities for jazz. And so you have these performers who travel around the country from one place to another performing music. And it becomes very, very popular in the white community. African American literature, Zora Neale Hurston and James Baldwin are two major figures from the Harlem Renaissance. And you have African American art, like Augusta Savage and Edmonia Lewis. Augusta Savage, the picture at the very bottom next to the Cotton Club, the harp, is her design, and it was the full figure. It was a huge statue that was featured at the World's Fair. Edmonia Lewis, who was in the upper right, is a sculptress, and the picture of Cleopatra sleeping was her sculpture. And the film industry begins to pick up after World War I. The first movie with sound was The Jazz Singer, featuring Al Jolson. They had movies prior to this point, but they were silent movies, usually accompanied by a piano player or organ player. African American movies are also being produced. Norman Studios in Jacksonville between 1920 and 1928 produced several movies, and there's a poster of one, The Flying Ace, in the bottom left. Mary Pickford becomes the queen of the movies, America's Sweetheart. That's her on the bottom right. And she becomes a figure for equality among women because she becomes very, very successful at being an actress. And she becomes one of the founding partners of the United Artists Studios with Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith. And so as we start talking about, we've been talking about immigration, and we're talking about changes within society. The American Civil Liberties Union is formed in 1970, coming out of the arrest of individuals under the Espionage and Sedition Acts during World War I. And it launches the formation of the Civil Liberties Bureau, but of course it changes its name to American Civil Liberties Union in 1920. Most of the members of the union were progressives or pacifists, and they were concerned about the violation of Americans' rights during this coercive patriotism period. In Shinnick versus United States, the Supreme Court, this was a Supreme Court case in 1919, that upheld the conviction of a man who was charged with sending anti-draft leaflets through the mail. And Justice Holmes declared that the First Amendment did not prevent Congress from prohibiting speech that presented a clear and present danger of inciting illegal actions. So obviously there's concern there around civil liberties for American citizens to be able to say or do things that they feel are important that may not be exactly supported by the federal government. Fundamentalist revolt, we have two instances where Christian evangelism enters into American society. The Scopes trial, John Scopes, who was a teacher, was persuaded to test a Tennessee law that restricted the teaching of evolution within the classroom. And it really is kind of a show more than a true court case. Clarence Darrow comes out of retirement to defend Scopes, and then William Jennings Bryant represents the state of Tennessee. And it's this huge thing that really doesn't solve much. All it does is it just brings a lot of hype around the issue of evolution and teaching it within the school system. Billy Sunday is an evangelist who becomes very famous in America and attracts a large number of people. And this is a predecessor to like Billy Graham, who had a massive following in the 1960s and 70s, would go on these crusades and attract thousands of people into arenas and speak about promoting a more healthy and Christian lifestyle. And certainly Billy Sunday promotes prohibition and helps in his way to pass the 18th Amendment banning the sale of alcohol. So talking about civil liberties, Sacco and Vanzetti were two men who were arrested for a crime, and essentially they're charged with it and they are eventually executed. But there are a lot of questions about whether or not they actually did it. They're charged with first-degree murder of, it's a failed, well, not really a failed robbery attempt. It's a robbery attempt where there was a payroll company, or I'm sorry, the payroll for the Slater and Morrill Shoe Company was being delivered, and these men come and rob the two men carrying the money, and the blame falls on Sacco and Vanzetti. There's sufficient evidence to suppose that they were probably innocent of it, but what gets them in trouble is they're both anarchists, and they don't believe in well, and it's during the middle of the Red Scare as well. So people began to protest around the United States and around Europe, calling for the men to be spared. But in August 1927, both men were executed in the electric chair. And it becomes really kind of a hallmark case of where men are found guilty because of their association and because of their beliefs, rather than actually committing the crime itself. The KKK is also part of this backlash against civil liberties. The second incarnation comes in 1915 at Stone Mountain in Atlanta, where you have a group of people come together, and the main agenda is an anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, prohibitionist, and anti-Semitic agenda. So they don't like immigrants, they don't like Catholics, they don't like Jews, and they support the banning of alcohol. Interestingly, though, the majority of the members are located in the Midwest and the West. Nearly 1 in 5 people in Indiana belong to the Klan. So this isn't really a Southern-driven organization in this particular time. You had more urban residents as members than rural residents. And many of the members fell into the middle to lower class. And at its peak, it had about 4 million members. And they also had an auxiliary group for women. And there's a picture in a parade of the women of the KKK. But what's important to think about this is that much of the sentiment against immigrants connects to the Red Scare, that there's this fear that immigrants are going to bring, especially Jewish immigrants, are going to bring radical thought or try to overthrow the government. And certainly in the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, the fact that they were immigrants and anarchists was enough to convict them and send them to the electric chair. So in 1921, we see the first of a series of laws enacted by Congress that would restrict the number of immigrants coming into the United States. So the number of immigrants from any country admitted annually to 3% of the number of residents from that same country living in the United States, as stated in the Census of 1910. So you take a look at the Census of 1910, and you take 3% of, let's say, Italians. So that is the cap on the number of immigrants from Italy that you can have coming into the United States. Think about this. Which countries had immigrants living in the United States in large numbers in 1910? This is before the Bolshevik Revolution. This is before the trouble in Russia, and largely a lot of the trouble in Europe before World War I. So most of these people were likely German, British, Irish, you had some Eastern European, maybe Russian. So professionals were allowed in without a quota qualification, and same for those in Latin America. A lot of that has to do with labor. The United States was getting a lot of labor from Latin America. But this law, for the first time, introduces some new elements: numerical limits on immigration and a quota system for establishing those limits. So new immigration to the country in 1920 was 805,228. Between 1921 and 1922, it drops to 308,556. That's a pretty big drop. So in 1924, they go even further with the Immigration Act that restricted the number of immigrants from any country admitted annually to 2% of the residents living in the U.S. stated by the Census of 1890. So we're going back further in time. So which countries had immigrants living in the United States in large numbers in 1890? And most of those are your British, Irish, and German immigrants. You didn't have the second wave of immigration yet. A couple of things that it also does is it established consular control. So immigrants didn't come to Ellis Island and apply for entry into the United States. Instead, you applied for entry into the United States in whatever embassy. So if you were in London, you went to the United States Embassy in London and applied, or wherever you were first, and then you were approved to come over at that point. So no immigrant was allowed to enter the U.S. without a valid immigration visa issued by an American consular officer abroad. So you had to go to the embassy and get this visa before you could even board the boat. Immigration from Great Britain and Ireland only fell about 19% through this law, but immigration from Italy fell 90%. So who is being targeted and why? It's largely Eastern European, largely Jewish, Italian immigrants who were not seen as very easy to assimilate into American society. So you can see this chart, selected annual immigration quotas under the 1924 Immigration Act. So the quota, 65,721. Poland, you have 6,500. Italy, 5,800. Russia, 2,700. Certainly a huge difference. The other part of this, too, is that we have the establishment of the Border Patrol. And this was established by Congress in 1924 as part of the Immigration Bureau in the Department of Labor. And it was supposed to stop illegal entries into the United States along the Mexico border and along the Canadian border. The first Border Patrol station was opened in Detroit, in Michigan, and the second is in El Paso, Texas. They began coastal patrols in 1925 and then Gulf Coast operations in 1927. So what this shows you is that there's some sense of urgency around preventing people from coming into the United States illegally. Let's see if there's anything else we need to do. What's interesting is that the Detroit office is largely busy trying to prevent people from importing alcohol illegally from Canada. El Paso, Texas is largely the Border Patrol with preventing illegals from coming into the United States through Mexico. Alrighty, and that is